Marcus Thompson stood in line at Miller's Pharmacy on Elm Street, clutching a prescription bottle and checking his watch for the third time in 2 minutes. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the linoleum floor. Behind him, an elderly man with weathered hands and a slight limp shifted his weight from foot to foot, studying the young man ahead of him with growing interest. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Tuesday afternoon rush at Miller's Pharmacy moved with the sluggish pace of cold honey. Marcus Thompson found himself seventh in line, trapped between a woman arguing loudly on her phone about insurance copays and a teenager scrolling through social media with the volume turned up just loud enough to be annoying. He adjusted the collar of his button-down shirt, feeling the familiar tightness across his shoulder where the fabric pulled against the raised skin beneath. 3 months had passed since his discharge from Riverside General Hospital, and Marcus still felt like a stranger in his own body. The prescription bottle in his hand contained tramadol, his lifeline for the chronic pain that had become his unwelcome companion since the accident. Physical therapy twice a week, occupational therapy on Fridays, and a medicine cabinet that looked like a small pharmacy. This had become his new normal at 28 years old. The line crept forward at a glacial pace. Mrs. Henderson, the pharmacist, moved with deliberate precision behind the counter, her silver hair pulled back in the same neat bun she'd worn for the past 15 years. Marcus had been coming to this pharmacy since he was a kid, picking up antibiotics for strep throat and allergy medication during pollen season. Now he was here for something far more serious, something that reminded him daily of how quickly life could change direction. Behind him, he heard the soft shuffle of worn sneakers on linoleum. The elderly man, Marcus estimated him to be in his 70s, had been standing there when Marcus arrived, but hadn't moved to grab a number or join the prescription pickup line. Instead, he seemed content to observe, his pale blue eyes taking in details that others might miss. His gray hair was cropped short in a style that suggested military precision, and despite his age, he carried himself with the kind of posture that spoke of decades of discipline. "Excuse me, son," the older man said quietly, his voice carrying the faint rasp of someone who'd spent years giving orders in harsh conditions. "That's quite a collection you've got there." Marcus glanced down at the 3 prescription bottles in his hand, suddenly self-conscious. "Yeah, well, modern medicine, right?" He attempted a casual smile, but it felt forced even to him. The man stepped closer, and Marcus caught the scent of Old Spice aftershave mixed with something else, maybe gun oil or leather cleaner. "Frank Mitchell," the older man said, extending a calloused hand. "And you don't need to pretend with me, I recognize the walk." "The walk?" Marcus shook the offered hand, noting the firm grip and the way Frank's eyes seemed to catalog everything about him in a single glance. "The way you favor your left side, the careful movements, the prescription bottles." Frank's voice dropped lower. "The look in your eyes that says you've seen things you wish you could forget." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. "I think you might have me confused with someone else, Mr. Mitchell. I'm not." "Military?" Frank finished. "No, I didn't think you were. But trauma leaves marks, son. Different kinds of trauma, same kinds of scars." The line moved forward again, bringing Marcus 2 spots closer to the pharmacy counter. He could hear Mrs. Henderson's patient voice explaining medication instructions to the elderly woman at the front of the line. The normalcy of the interaction felt surreal against the backdrop of Frank's penetrating observations. "How did you know?" Marcus asked despite himself. Frank gestured toward Marcus's right shoulder, where his shirt had shifted slightly. "Burn scars have a particular texture to the skin around them, and the way you unconsciously protect that side when people get too close, that's learned behavior. Something happened to you, something that involved fire and pain, and you're still carrying it with you." Marcus instinctively tugged his shirt back into place, his face flushing with embarrassment. He'd thought he'd been subtle about hiding the scarring, but apparently he'd been wrong. "It was a house fire," he said quietly, 3 months ago. "I was visiting my sister's family for dinner when their kitchen caught fire. I got my nephew out, but—" He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. "But you paid a price for it," Frank said, his tone gentle but matter-of-fact. "Third-degree burns, I'm guessing, surgery, skin grafts, months of recovery. And now, you're dealing with chronic pain that the doctors say might never fully go away." Marcus stared at the older man in shock. How could you possibly know all that? Because I've been where you are, son. Different circumstances, same journey. Frank pulled back the sleeve of his jacket, revealing scarring along his forearm that bore the telltale signs of old shrapnel wounds. Vietnam, 1968. I was a medic with the 101st Airborne. Caught the wrong end of a mortar round while trying to patch up my squad leader. The pharmacy suddenly felt smaller, more intimate. Marcus found himself looking at Frank with new eyes, seeing past the elderly exterior to the young soldier who had once faced his own moment of choice between safety and sacrifice. The difference, Frank continued, is that I had the military medical system to help me through the recovery. Physical therapy, pain management, psychological support. You look like you're trying to handle this on your own. Marcus felt his throat tighten. My insurance covers the basics, but there's only so much they'll approve. And my family tries to help, but they don't really understand what it's like to wake up every morning and have to negotiate with your own body just to get dressed. Next, Mrs. Henderson called from behind the counter. Marcus realized he'd reached the front of the line. He stepped forward, handed over his prescription bottles, and waited while Mrs. Henderson pulled up his information on the computer. The familiar routine felt automatic. Insurance card, copay, signature on the electronic pad. But he remained acutely aware of Frank's presence behind him, as if the older man's understanding had created some kind of invisible connection between them. Mr. Thompson, Mrs. Henderson said with her usual professional kindness, your tramadol is ready, but I'm showing that your physical therapy authorization expires next week. You'll want to check with your doctor about getting that renewed. Thanks, Mrs. Henderson. I'll call them tomorrow. Marcus pocketed the prescription bottle and stepped aside, expecting Frank to move forward to conduct his own business. Instead, the older man followed him toward the exit. You know, Frank said as they walked through the automatic doors into the late afternoon sunshine, there are resources available that you might not know about. Programs specifically designed to help people who've been through traumatic injuries, even if they're not military-related. Marcus paused on the sidewalk outside the pharmacy, squinting in the bright daylight. What kind of resources? Frank reached into his wallet and pulled out a business card that looked like it had been handled frequently. There's a nonprofit organization called Second Chances. They work with trauma survivors. All kinds of trauma. House fires, car accidents, workplace injuries, combat wounds. They understand that physical scars are only part of the story. Marcus took the card, reading the simple text, Second Chances Foundation, Rebuilding Lives After Trauma. There was a phone number and an address across town that he didn't recognize. I volunteer there twice a week, Frank explained. We run support groups, help people navigate the medical system, provide resources for things that insurance doesn't cover, and sometimes we just listen to people who need someone to understand what they're going through. I don't know, Marcus said hesitantly. I'm not really the support group type. Frank smiled, and for the first time, Marcus saw warmth replace the analytical intensity in the older man's eyes. Neither was I, son. It took me 15 years after Vietnam to admit I needed help dealing with what I'd been through. Don't make the same mistake I did. Marcus stared at the business card in his hand, feeling the weight of Frank's words settling over him like a heavy blanket. The afternoon traffic on Elm Street hummed past them, a steady stream of normalcy that felt disconnected from the intensity of their conversation. What exactly happens at these support groups? Marcus asked, surprising himself with the question. He'd been so focused on getting through each day that he hadn't considered there might be others walking a similar path. Frank leaned against the brick wall of the pharmacy, his weathered face thoughtful. Well, it's not what you might expect. No circle of chairs with people crying into tissues, if that's what you're worried about. Dr. Sarah Chen, she's the psychologist who runs the program. She's got a different approach. The name meant nothing to Marcus, but something in Frank's tone suggested that Dr. Chen was someone worth knowing. Different how? She focuses on practical skills first, emotional processing second, how to manage chronic pain without becoming dependent on medication. How to adapt your living space so daily tasks don't become battles. How to have conversations with family members who want to help, but don't know how. Frank shifted his weight, favoring his left leg slightly. Talking about feelings comes later, when you're ready for it. Marcus found himself nodding. The practical approach appealed to him far more than the idea of sitting in a circle discussing his emotions with strangers. And it's free? Completely. The foundation is funded by grants and private donations. Dr. Chen started it after her husband was injured in a construction accident 7 years ago. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Through the system and realized there was a gap between medical treatment and actually rebuilding a life. A police cruiser pulled into the pharmacy parking lot, and Marcus watched as Officer Rodriguez stepped out, someone he'd known since high school. The sight of a familiar face from his old life created an unexpected pang of longing for the simplicity he'd once taken for granted. The thing is, Frank continued, trauma changes you in ways that go beyond the physical damage. Your brain rewires itself around the experience. The constant vigilance, the way you scan every room for potential dangers, the hyper-awareness of your body's limitations. That's not weakness, son. That's survival adaptation. But it can become a prison if you don't learn how to manage it. Marcus felt a chill of recognition. He had been scanning the pharmacy for exits when he walked in, had positioned himself so he could see both the entrance and the back of the store. He had attributed it to general anxiety, but Frank's words suggested something deeper. "How do you know so much about this stuff?" Marcus asked. 20 years of trial and error, mostly." Frank's smile was rueful. "After Vietnam, I came home to a country that didn't want to hear about what we'd been through. I buried myself in work, construction, ironwork, anything that kept my hands busy and my mind occupied. Married my high school sweetheart, had 2 kids, built what looked like a normal life from the outside." Frank paused, watching a young mother push a stroller past them on the sidewalk. But the nightmares never stopped. The hypervigilance got worse. I couldn't sit with my back to a door and couldn't handle sudden loud noises. My wife Linda tried to understand, but I couldn't explain what I was carrying around inside my head. Eventually, she stopped trying to reach me. "What happened?" Marcus asked, though he suspected he already knew. "Divorce. Lost custody of my kids for a while because I wasn't deemed emotionally stable. Spent 5 years drinking myself into oblivion, working jobs that didn't require much human interaction." Frank's voice remained steady, but Marcus could see the cost of those memories in the older man's eyes. "Rock bottom came when my daughter Jennifer was getting married and didn't invite me to the wedding because she was afraid I'd cause a scene." The weight of Frank's story settled between them. Marcus could see a possible future version of himself in the older man's words: isolation, broken relationships, a life defined by avoidance rather than engagement. "But something changed," Marcus said. "It wasn't a question. Jennifer's husband-to-be was a social worker. He convinced her to give me one more chance, but with conditions. I had to get professional help, and I had to prove I was serious about addressing what was wrong with me." Frank straightened up from the wall. "That's when I found Dr. Chen's program. It was just starting then. Maybe 8 people in a converted office space above a dental clinic." A delivery truck rumbled past, its diesel engine creating a momentary barrier of noise between them and the rest of the world. Marcus found himself grateful for the interruption. Frank's story was hitting closer to home than he'd expected. "The first session, I sat in the back corner and didn't say a word for 2 hours, Frank continued. Dr. Chen didn't push. She talked about the neuroscience of trauma, showed us brain scans that explained why we felt like we were losing our minds. For the first time since Vietnam, someone was telling me that my reactions were normal responses to abnormal experiences. And that helped? It was a start. The real breakthrough came when I met Tom Reeves, a firefighter who'd been caught in a building collapse. Different uniforms, different circumstances, but the same rewired brain. He understood things about my experience that I'd never been able to put into words." Marcus thought about his sister's family, how they'd tried so hard to act normal around him after the fire. How his nephew Tommy, the 4-year-old he'd carried out of the burning house, now seemed afraid of him. The child couldn't articulate why, but Marcus had noticed how Tommy would position himself behind furniture when Marcus visited, creating barriers between them. "The isolation is the worst part," Marcus said quietly. "Everyone wants you to get better, to go back to being who you were before, but that person doesn't exist anymore." Frank nodded slowly. "That's the hardest truth to accept. You can't go back, but you can go forward. And that forward version of yourself might be stronger than who you were before if you're willing to do the work." Quote. A text message chimed on Marcus's phone. He glanced at it and saw a message from his sister Rachel. "Tommy keeps asking when Uncle Marcus is coming over again." Maybe this weekend? The simple message created a complex knot of emotions. Marcus wanted to see his nephew, wanted to rebuild that relationship, but he also feared seeing apprehension in the boy's eyes. What if his presence was more harmful than helpful? Dr. Chen talks about something called post-traumatic growth, Frank said, as if reading Marcus's thoughts. The idea that trauma, while devastating, can also create opportunities for developing strengths and perspectives you didn't have before. But it doesn't happen automatically. It requires intentional work. What kind of work? Learning to reframe your relationship with the experience. Instead of seeing yourself as a victim of random tragedy, you start to understand yourself as someone who faced an impossible situation and made a choice that saved a life. The scars become evidence of courage rather than reminders of damage. Marcus looked down at his right shoulder, where the fabric of his shirt concealed the worst of the burn scarring. He'd been thinking of the marks as disfigurement, as evidence of his body's failure to protect itself. The idea that they might represent something else entirely felt both foreign and oddly appealing. "There's a group session Thursday evening," Frank said, pulling out his phone to check the time. 7 o'clock, in the community center on Maple Street. Dr. Chen always says that the hardest part is walking through the door the first time. Marcus felt his chest tighten with familiar anxiety. "I don't know if I'm ready for that." "Son, I don't think anyone ever feels ready. But sometimes ready isn't the point. Sometimes being willing is enough." Thursday evening arrived faster than Marcus had anticipated. He sat in his Honda Civic outside the Maple Street Community Center, engine running, air conditioning, fighting against the humid September heat. The digital clock on his dashboard read 6:47 p.m. 13 minutes until the support group session began, 13 minutes to decide whether he would walk through those glass doors or drive home to another evening of Netflix and pain medication. Through the community center's windows, he could see people beginning to gather in what appeared to be a multi-purpose room. Some moved with the careful deliberation he recognized in himself, others seemed more comfortable in their bodies. A woman with a prosthetic leg chatted animatedly with a man whose left arm hung at an unusual angle. Their easy interactions suggested a familiarity that went beyond casual acquaintance. Marcus's phone buzzed with a text from Frank. "Parking around back if you need more privacy walking in. No pressure, but we'd be glad to have you." The older man's intuitive understanding of Marcus's anxiety was both comforting and slightly unnerving. How had Frank known he would be sitting out here, wrestling with second thoughts? At 6:52, Marcus made his decision. He turned off the engine, grabbed the business card Frank had given him, and walked toward the entrance before he could change his mind again. The community center lobby smelled like industrial carpet cleaner and coffee. A hand-lettered sign pointed toward Second Chances Foundation, Conference Room B. Marcus followed the arrow down a hallway lined with bulletin boards, advertising yoga classes, senior citizen luncheons, and youth basketball leagues. The normalcy of it all felt reassuring somehow. Conference Room B turned out to be larger than he'd expected, with about 15 folding chairs arranged in a loose circle. 8 people were already seated, ranging in age from what looked like early 20s to Frank's generation. Dr. Sarah Chen stood near a whiteboard, organizing what appeared to be handouts. She was younger than Marcus had imagined, probably in her early 40s, with shoulder-length black hair and an expression that managed to be both professional and genuinely warm. Frank spotted Marcus in the doorway and raised his hand in a subtle wave, gesturing to an empty chair beside him. Marcus nodded and made his way over, hyper-aware of how his slight limp became more pronounced when he was nervous. "Glad you made it," Frank said quietly as Marcus settled into the chair. "How are you feeling?" "Terrified," Marcus admitted, then surprised himself by adding, "but curious." Dr. Chen waited until exactly 7 o'clock before beginning. "Good evening, everyone. For those who are new or visiting, I'm Sarah Chen, and this is our weekly trauma recovery support group. We have a few new faces tonight, which is wonderful." Her eyes briefly met Marcus's, acknowledging his presence without making him feel singled out. "Tonight I want to talk about something we call narrative reconstruction," she continued. "The stories we tell ourselves about our experiences have tremendous power over how we move forward. Often, trauma creates what we might call a victim narrative, a story in which we are primarily defined by what happened to us rather than how we responded to it. She moved to the whiteboard and wrote 2 phrases, "This happened to me, and I survived this." Same facts, different emphasis, she explained. Both statements are true, but they create very different psychological frameworks for processing the experience. A woman in her 30s with visible scarring on her neck and arms raised her hand. "Dr. Chen, I've been here for 6 months, and I still struggle with feeling like the car accident defines everything about my life now. How do you shift from feeling like a victim to feeling like a survivor?" Marcus found himself leaning forward, genuinely interested in the answer. This woman, her name tag read Jessica, was articulating something he hadn't been able to put into words. "That's an excellent question, Jessica. And I think the answer is different for everyone, but it often starts with identifying the choices you made during and after the traumatic event. Jessica, you were in a head-on collision caused by a drunk driver, correct?" Jessica nodded. 3 surgeries, 8 months of recovery, and chronic pain that will probably never go away completely. "And in the immediate aftermath of the accident, what did you do?" Jessica looked puzzled. "What do you mean? I was unconscious for 2 days." "Before you lose consciousness, the paramedics report said you managed to call 911, despite having a concussion and multiple fractures. You gave them your exact location and described the other driver's condition. Your actions directly contributed to both of you receiving faster medical attention." Marcus watched Jessica's expression change as she processed this information. "I never thought about it that way. I just remembered being scared and hurt." "Fear and courage aren't mutually exclusive," Dr. Chen said. "You can be terrified and still take life-saving action. In fact, I'd argue that true courage only exists in the presence of fear." A man across the circle, his name tag read David, spoke up. "That's similar to what happened to me. The house fire got my neighbors out, but I kept focusing on the smoke inhalation damage to my lungs rather than the fact that the Martinez family is alive because I knocked on their door at 2 in the morning." Marcus felt his heart rate increase. The parallel to his own experience was uncomfortably close. He glanced at Frank, who was watching him with a knowing expression. Dr. Chen noticed the exchange. Would anyone like to share a recent experience with narrative reconstruction? Sometimes hearing how others are working through this process can be helpful. The room fell quiet for a moment. Marcus felt the weight of expectation, not from the group pressing him to speak, but from his own internal struggle with the story he'd been telling himself for the past 3 months. "I'm new here," he said finally, his voice sounding strange in his own ears. "Marcus Thompson. 3 months ago, there was a fire at my sister's house while I was visiting. I got my 4-year-old nephew out, but I was burned pretty badly in the process." He paused, looking around the circle. Every face was attentive but not judgmental, interested but not pitying. It was a different kind of audience than he'd expected. "I keep thinking about how I should have been faster, should have gotten to Tommy sooner so we both could have avoided the worst of the smoke and flames. I replay the whole thing in my head, looking for ways I could have done it better." "What does your sister say about that night?" Dr. Chen asked gently. Marcus felt his throat tighten. "She says I saved her son's life. She says Tommy talks about how Uncle Marcus carried him out like a superhero. But when I see him now, he seems afraid of me. I think the scars scare him, or maybe he associates me with that traumatic night." "Have you asked your sister about Tommy's behavior?" "No," Marcus admitted. "I've been avoiding spending too much time around him because I don't want to make things worse." Frank cleared his throat. "Marcus, can I share something my daughter told me about kids and trauma?" Marcus nodded. "Jennifer said that after my wife and I divorced, she used to hide when I came to pick her up for visitation. I thought it was because she was afraid of me, because of my PTSD symptoms. Turns out she was hiding because she was afraid I wouldn't come back. Kids don't always process fear the way adults do." Dr. Chen picked up the thread. "Children who've experienced trauma often become hypervigilant about the people who represent safety to them. Tommy might be positioning himself behind furniture not because he's afraid of you, but because he's keeping track of where you are, making sure his rescuer doesn't disappear." The possibility hit Marcus like a physical blow. He'd been interpreting Tommy's behavior through the lens of his own insecurities, rather than considering alternative explanations. "There's one way to find out," Jessica said softly. "Spend time with him. Let him tell you his version of the story." Marcus looked around the circle again, seeing these people not as broken individuals defined by their trauma, but as human beings who had faced impossible circumstances and found ways to keep moving forward. Frank had been right. There was something powerful about being in a room with people who understood the weight of carrying invisible scars alongside visible ones. "I think I'd like to do that," Marcus said, "and I think I'd like to keep coming to these meetings if that's okay." Dr. Chen smiled. "It's more than okay, Marcus. It's exactly why we're here." As the session continued, Marcus found himself contributing to discussions about pain management strategies, workplace accommodations, and the challenge of maintaining relationships when chronic pain affected mood and energy levels. For the first time since the fire, he felt like he was part of a community that understood his new reality, without trying to fix it or rush him through it. When the meeting ended at 8:30, Marcus lingered as the group slowly dispersed. Frank approached him as he was putting on his jacket. "So what do you think?" "I think I was wrong about a lot of things," Marcus said, "and I think I have a nephew to visit this weekend." Frank clapped him gently on the shoulder. "The uninjured one," Marcus noted with gratitude. "That sounds like a good place to start." Walking out to the parking lot, Marcus realized that the story he'd been telling himself was changing. Not the facts. Those would always be the same. But the meaning, the emphasis, the identity he built around those facts, that was something he had more control over than he'd realized. His phone buzzed with another text from Rachel. "Tommy built a fort in the living room and says it's for when Uncle Marcus comes over so they can be superheroes together." Marcus smiled, feeling something shift inside his chest. Maybe Frank had been right about post-traumatic growth. Maybe the scars really could become evidence of courage rather than reminders of damage. He had work to do, he knew that. Healing wasn't a destination but an ongoing process. But for the first time in 3 months, the future felt like something he could actively participate in creating, rather than something that was simply happening to him. As he drove home through the quiet streets, Marcus was already planning his conversation with Tommy for the weekend. There was a story to be rewritten, and he was finally ready to pick up the pen. Saturday morning arrived with unseasonably cool weather and clear skies. Marcus stood on Rachel's front porch, holding a small gift bag, and feeling more nervous than he had since his first day back at work after the accident. Through the living room window, he could see the elaborate blanket fort Tommy had constructed, complete with string lights and what appeared to be a "No Villains Allowed" sign written in red crayon. Rachel opened the door before he could knock, her face brightening with a smile that carried undertones of relief. "He's been asking about you every hour since he woke up," she said, stepping aside to let him in. "I think he's more excited about this visit than he was about his birthday party." The house still carried faint traces of smoke damage despite the professional cleaning and partial renovation. New drywall in the kitchen, fresh paint throughout the main floor, updated smoke detectors that seemed to chirp every few minutes as if announcing their vigilance. But life had clearly resumed. Toys scattered across the coffee table, Saturday morning cartoons playing on the television, the comforting chaos of a family rebuilding their normal routines. "Uncle Marcus," Tommy's voice carried from inside the fort, followed by the sound of small feet scrambling across hardwood floors. The boy emerged from his blanket creation like a jack-in-the-box, wearing a red cape that looked suspiciously like one of Rachel's scarves and a construction paper mask decorated with glitter. But instead of running directly to Marcus as he might have before the fire, Tommy stopped about 3 feet away and studied his uncle's face intently. Marcus held his breath, wondering if this was the moment when his nephew would finally voice whatever fears or concerns had been keeping him at a distance. "Does it still hurt?" Tommy asked quietly, his 4-year-old directness cutting straight to the heart of things adults spent months dancing around. Marcus knelt down to Tommy's eye level, feeling the familiar pull of scarred skin across his shoulder and back. "Sometimes it does, buddy, but not as much as it used to. And you know what? It was worth it, because it meant I could get you out of the house safely." Tommy nodded gravely, processing this information with the seriousness that children bring to important revelations. Then, to Marcus's surprise, the boy reached out and gently touched the visible edge of scarring that extended just above Marcus's collar. "Mom says these are your brave marks," Tommy said, "like when superheroes get hurt saving people, but then they wear the marks like medals." Marcus felt his throat constrict with emotion. He glanced at Rachel, who was watching from the kitchen doorway with tears in her eyes. "Your mom is pretty smart," he managed. "I have brave marks too," Tommy announced, pulling up his shirt to reveal a small, faded scar on his ribs from a minor cut he'd sustained during the evacuation. "But mine are littler because I'm still learning how to be brave like you." The simple profundity of a child's logic nearly undid Marcus completely. Here was his nephew, Not traumatized by association, but inspired by connection. Not afraid of his scars, but proud of his own small mark of survival. Dr. Chen's words about narrative reconstruction suddenly felt less like psychological theory and more like lived truth. "Hey, Tommy," Marcus said, pulling the gift bag from behind his back. "I brought something I thought we could use in your fort." Tommy's eyes widened as he opened the bag and pulled out a small flashlight shaped like a smartphone, the kind that projected different colored lights onto walls and ceilings. "Cool, we can make it look like we're in a spaceship or a secret hideout." "That's exactly what I was thinking. Mind if I check out your fort?" "It looks pretty impressive from out here." Tommy grabbed Marcus's hand. The left one, Marcus noted, instinctively understanding which side was less sensitive, and pulled him toward the blanket structure. "I made it extra big so we could both fit, and I put all the soft pillows on your side because Mom said you might need extra cushioning." Inside the fort, Marcus was amazed by the level of detail Tommy had achieved. Comic books were carefully arranged as reading material. A small cooler held juice boxes and crackers, and a tablet was queued up to what appeared to be a playlist of superhero movie soundtracks. But what struck Marcus most was a drawing taped to one of the blanket walls. A crude but unmistakable depiction of a tall figure carrying a smaller figure away from a house with orange and red scribbles representing flames. "I drew that," Tommy said, following Marcus's gaze. "That's you carrying me out of the fire. I drew it so I wouldn't forget how you saved me." Marcus stared at the drawing, seeing his experience reflected through completely different eyes. Where he had seen failure and trauma, Tommy saw heroism and rescue. Where he had focused on damage and loss, his nephew saw protection and love in action. "Can I tell you something, Tommy?" Marcus said, settling carefully onto the pile of pillows. "For a long time after the fire, I was sad, because I thought maybe I had scared you or made you remember bad things. I was worried that seeing me might make you feel afraid." Tommy looked genuinely puzzled by this revelation. "Afraid of you? But you're the one who saves people." "Why would I be afraid of someone who saves people?" The question hung in the air between them, profound in its simplicity. Marcus realized he had been projecting his own fears and insecurities onto a child who possessed a clearer understanding of the situation than he did. "Sometimes grown-ups overthink things," Marcus admitted. "We worry about stuff that kids understand better than we do. Like how Mom worried that I would be scared of the new smoke detectors, but actually, they make me feel safer, because now I know they'll tell us if there's ever another fire." Exactly like that. They spent the next 2 hours in the fort, using the projection flashlight to create elaborate scenarios where they were space explorers, investigating alien planets, deep-sea divers discovering underwater cities, and secret agents infiltrating villain headquarters. Tommy's imagination was boundless, and his natural inclusion of Marcus in every adventure gradually dissolved the last of the barriers that trauma had constructed between them. Around noon, Rachel called them out for lunch, grilled cheese sandwiches and tomato soup, comfort food that felt appropriate for a day of reconnection. As they ate, Tommy regaled his mother with detailed accounts of their fort adventures, his excitement infectious, and his easy physical proximity to Marcus, a balm that Marcus hadn't realized he needed. "I have an idea," Tommy announced as he finished his sandwich. "Next time you come over, we should build an even bigger fort in the backyard. And maybe we could have a sleepover. I could teach you how to make s'mores without catching anything on fire." The innocent comment about fire might have stung a few days ago, but in the context of Tommy's enthusiasm and trust, it felt like evidence of how completely the boy had integrated the experience into his worldview without letting it define or limit him. "That sounds like an amazing plan," Marcus said, "but maybe we should ask your mom first." Rachel nodded enthusiastically. "I think that sounds wonderful. It's been too long since we've had Uncle Marcus sleep over." As the afternoon progressed, Marcus found himself relaxing in ways he hadn't experienced since before the accident. The chronic pain was still present, probably always would be, but it felt more manageable when he wasn't carrying the additional weight of guilt and isolation. Tommy's easy acceptance and genuine joy in his presence created a space where healing felt not just possible, but natural. Around 4 o'clock, Marcus's phone buzzed with a text from Frank. "How did the visit go?" Remember, courage isn't the absence of fear. It's action in the presence of fear. Marcus showed the message to Rachel, who read it with interest. "Frank sounds like a wise man. I'd like to meet him sometime." "He's been coming to the support group meetings I've started attending," Marcus explained. Vietnam veteran who understands what it's like to carry invisible scars alongside visible ones. I'm proud of you for going to those meetings, Rachel said softly. I've been worried about you isolating yourself, but I didn't know how to help without making things worse. You helped more than you know just by being patient with me while I figured things out. And Tommy helped by being exactly who he is. Someone who sees the world in ways that remind adults what really matters. As evening approached, Marcus reluctantly began preparing to leave. Tommy extracted promises for the backyard fort sleepover, the s'mores tutorial, and regular visits that wouldn't require special occasions or extended gaps between them. Uncle Marcus, Tommy said as Marcus was putting on his jacket, can I ask you something important? Of course, buddy. What is it? Do you think other kids who get scared in fires have uncles who will carry them out? The question revealed a depth of empathy that took Marcus's breath away. Tommy wasn't just thinking about his own experience, but wondering about other children who might face similar dangers. I think most kids are very lucky to have people who love them enough to keep them safe, Marcus said carefully. And I think there are lots of grown-ups who would be brave enough to help a child who needed rescuing, even if it meant getting hurt themselves. Tommy nodded solemnly. Good, because every kid should have someone like you. Driving home that evening, Marcus felt a fundamental shift in how he understood his place in the world. The fire would always be part of his story, and the physical limitations would always require ongoing management. But the meaning he attached to those facts had undergone a transformation that felt both profound and permanent. He thought about Dr. Chen's concept of narrative reconstruction, about Frank's patient wisdom, about Tommy's intuitive understanding of courage and protection. Each had contributed to a new framework for understanding not just what had happened to him, but who he had chosen to become in response to it. His phone rang as he pulled into his apartment complex. Rachel's name appeared on the screen. I just wanted to thank you, she said when he answered. Today was the first time since the fire that Tommy seemed completely like himself again. Whatever you've been doing to work through this, it's helping all of us heal. Thank you for being patient with me while I figured out how to be his uncle again, Marcus replied. And thank you for raising a kid who sees the world clearly enough to remind adults what heroism actually looks like. After ending the call, Marcus sat in his car for a few more minutes, processing the day's revelations. The journey ahead would still require work, more support group meetings, ongoing medical management, the slow rebuilding of confidence and identity. But for the first time since the accident, that work felt like movement towards something positive, rather than just away from something painful. He thought about Frank's words from their first meeting outside the pharmacy. Sometimes willing is enough. Today had proven that willing could be more than enough. It could be the foundation for rebuilding not just a life, but a sense of purpose and connection that transcended the circumstances that had initially seemed to define everything. Walking up to his apartment, Marcus was already planning his next visit with Tommy, his next support group meeting, and his next conversation with Frank about the mysterious ways that trauma could, with the right support and perspective, become a doorway to strength rather than just a reminder of vulnerability. The scars would always be there, visible reminders of a night when everything changed. But now they felt less like marks of damage and more like evidence of a choice. The choice to act with courage when courage was required, regardless of the personal cost. And that, Marcus realized, was a story worth telling. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.